Welcome to the CFB Dynasty Podcast with hosts Matt Knowles, Brian McElfresh, and Doug Gravely.
Hey everybody, how you doing out there? It's time for another CFB Dynasty Podcast. My name is Matt Knowles. I'm sitting here alongside the founder and the creator of CFBDynasty.com, Brian McElfresh. We've got a great show for you today. We're going to have the top 8 teams trending up or trending good, teams trending bad when it comes to the college fantasy football playoffs. B-Mac, tell us what your motivation was for this topic of the show today.
Yeah, sure. I will go ahead and share my screen. And essentially, so if you come into the rankings, what we've updated in the last week is for every, I'll just say this is the draft prep, draft central section. And once you're logged in, you can click on rankings for those positions, kicker and defense, and cheat sheet coming soon, dynasty coming soon, Devi is in there. And I don't have these things in here yet for Devi, but we added conference as a column in here because we have a lot of people over the years that have reached out to us and just said, hey, our league is like Big Ten plus Notre Dame, so we want to be able to have rankings that are specific to our league. So you can download these rankings and use filters in Excel or Google Sheets or whatever you use to get it down to the specific conference or conferences that are in your player pool. And if you didn't know, Fantrax allows complete customization by team, by conference, however you want to do it and set up your league. And the rankings are flexible for that reason. We added bye weeks, weeks plural, because everyone has at least 2 this year. And we'll get into that and some of the strategy behind this, and something that burned me in the fantasy playoffs. I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, prompted me to add this to our rankings and really just to my own personal research, as I had really bad matchups going into the fantasy playoffs and bye weeks and all kinds of stuff. So now this is just part of the rankings. If you're on a phone, you'll have to click the little plus sign on any player to see what their fantasy playoffs are. But on your desktop or whatever laptop, you can see that it's right there in the column all the way to the right. So you can see exactly who your player or potentially player that you're thinking about drafting, how they'll finish the season. Because, you know, like Herm Edwards said, right, Matt, you play to win the game, and you can't win if you get to the playoffs and you've got bad matchups
That's
whatever.
Right. So that's going to be
we'll go over that. We've got some good ones. We've got some that are really good and some that are really bad, including a player that I've been trying to deal for in our dynasty league for all off season with Mike Davis, and haven't been able to get it done. But I feel better about it now after researching for today's show. So
before we get to the meat of the show, the top 8 teams trending up, top 8 teams trending down, we do have a couple other quick things, just, real world things to talk about. And the thing we know that everybody tuning into a college fantasy football podcast wants to talk about is the Stanley Cup.
Oh,
that's right. So why do we bring up the Stanley Cup? So if you don't know, this podcast originates from the state of Florida. And in the year 2023, people wanted to whip on the state of Florida as the bridesmaids. And what do I mean by that? In the year 2023, you had the Florida Panthers went to the Stanley Cup Finals and lost. You had the Miami Hurricanes and the Florida Atlantic Owls that went to the Final Four in college basketball, didn't get past there. You had the Miami Heat that went to the NBA Finals and lost. You also had Florida State, who thought they were cheated out of a college football playoff spot, which is a whole totally different discussion. But you had a lot of teams in the state of Florida that were bridesmaids that were never the bride. Right now, in the Stanley Cup Finals, the Florida Panthers are up 3-0 on the Edmonton Oilers. They need one more game to break through and not be the bridesmaid and actually get a championship for the state of Florida. So BMAC, as somebody who doesn't pay attention to hockey at all, if Doug Gravely came into your office and took you by the back of your shirt and said, you need to go on to DraftKings right now and place a bet on the Florida Panthers, would you say they're going to win in 4 games, 5 games, 6 games, 7 games, or not at all? What would your bet be if you had to place it right now?
Home ice doesn't matter as much, I don't think. So I'm going to go 4 games. Let's go with a sweep.
And you know what? That's probably an educated.
How little I pay attention to it.
Well, I can tell you that's probably an educated decision. Florida Panthers are putting up an incredible defense right now. I mean, granted, I don't pay as much attention to hockey as a lot of other people, but I do pay attention when we get to the playoffs. And the defense they're putting out there, they had a great game last night in Edmonton. One of the farthest, you got 2,600 miles, something insane between Sunrise and Edmonton. So yeah, it's one of the farthest you could possibly get between 2 cities for a championship in any sport in the United States and North America. But yeah, so we're talking about teams that have made it to the championship. College fantasy football, we're talking about championships. And before we move forward, I got to give a shout out to NC State. Only school in the country to have a team in college football top 25, to send men's and women's basketball to the Final Four, and to put a team in the College Baseball World Series.
Heck yeah.
And they're talking, it's the revenge tour. They got completely screwed out of the opportunity to actually win the championship in 2021 because of COVID. We'll see if NC State cannot be a bridesmaid this year and actually win something for once. But that's enough about these other sports. People want to come onto this podcast to hear about what they can do to not be the bridesmaid in college fantasy football. They want to be able to get their information to be able to prepare to win their championship. What we're talking about today, which is a huge, huge topic of discussion, top 8 teams with a schedule that trends up, top 8 teams with a schedule that trends down when it comes to the college fantasy playoffs. Now, one of the big notes that you put in the notes, which is something that people really need to think about too, is that this year the playoffs are weeks 12 through 14.
Yep.
Normally it's weeks 11 through 13. This only happens about every 5 to 7 years where there's an extra week during the regular season. Most leagues have had a 10-week regular season. This year it's an 11-week regular season. As my late brother would say, more games means more fun, but what that also means is more bye weeks. So a lot of times you'll have teams with 1 bye week. This year everybody's going to have 2, and a certain lucky few schools are going to have 3. Teams like Hawaii, Georgia Tech, Florida State will have 3 bye weeks because they're playing in week 0.
Yep.
So this year, more than anything, you need to pay attention to those additional bye weeks. And when we get into the topic of today, some of those bye weeks are going to come into play. So B-Mac, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your experience when it comes to bad bye weeks? I know a few years ago, I had a terrible bye week situation where I had to go in with my QB4 from FAU against you in a semi. We knew that you were going to beat the freaking brakes off of me in that game because I basically was starting no quarterback. This guy was the last quarterback on my roster. Nothing I could do about it. I had injuries. I had really bad bye weeks in week 12 that year. But talk about your experiences of bad bye weeks when you get to the playoffs.
Well, essentially, obviously you want to have the best team during the season just to make the playoffs. But when you get there, that's where you can have big advantages. And we've had that everybody makes fun of the SEC for what would be the fantasy semifinal, where it's like everyone's got a beat down scheduled, and that's not good for fantasy either, because you don't know if your running back's going to play till halftime and hasn't scored a touchdown yet, and they're putting in 3rd, 4th stringers as you get to the end of the game. So looking at your matchups, and this is big. So obviously if you're in a draft where you have limited pickups, like in our home league, or if you're in a different league with limited pickups, that stinks. But then also looking forward as you're making waiver wire pickups, we'll look at something like Dylan Gabriel, for example, in Oregon. They have a pretty tough schedule here sort of in the playoffs. We'll talk about that, but then really how you need to draft against it. So if you take Dillon Gabriel, who has a bye week in the college fantasy semifinal, you'll need to draft accordingly. You'll need to get a couple guys, knowing that you won't have a really early round, probably round 1, round 2 investment in quarterback. You'll need to back that with a couple guys who have a great schedule in the fantasy playoffs. And this can shift. This can shift how rankings look. It hasn't really for us yet. We'll go over that probably this week. But yeah, as you look at Caden Salter versus Dillon Gabriel and drafting them, or Byron Brown in there, figuring out how you want to value them, fantasy playoffs would clearly favor 2 of them over Gabriel. But,
and the thing too to think about too, it also matters the kind of league you're in. If you're drafting in a single season redraft league, this information is going to matter far more than if you're in a dynasty league or a Devi league, because you might be like, hey, I'll take the hit in that 1 week or those couple of weeks this season because I've got the next Patrick Mahomes, hoping that you're going to get the guy that's going to be on your pro team for a decade.
Yep.
But yeah. So when you're talking about a dynasty league, especially a league that's got limited pickups, this information is of huge, huge importance.
And I didn't pay attention to it as much till I got bit by it. I was always one to just take the best players possible, and depth matters a ton when you get into the playoffs. Like you and I have both battled injury issues in the playoffs, and that's just going to happen over a 16, 17 year league. But also just being able to have a strategic advantage above your league mates who may or aren't likely looking ahead to the fantasy playoffs yet. Just knowing that, hey, there's some players you might want to avoid based on what we're talking about today. And then some we'll look at that is like a huge benefit of players that you would want to draft high because of their fantasy playoffs.
All right, so BMAC, do you want to get right into it? Let's get
go.
to the top 8 teams that are trending upwards when it comes to favorable schedules in the college fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, and I'll throw this up on the screen here so anyone watching can see. Let's start with Caden Salter. Obviously, that's where your mind goes when you're talking Liberty football right now. He's going to be one of the top CFF quarterbacks taken, if not the top. I know in a lot of leagues, a lot of mock drafts, he's the number 1 guy that comes off the board. And you're not going to be disappointed by what you see in the fantasy playoffs. So his bye weeks are weeks 6 and 8. So you got that middle stretch there where you'll need a good backup. But he's at UMass, and then he's going to be in the semifinal in a shootout against Western Kentucky and TJ Finley. So that's like the perfect game there for Salter, and then finishes off at Sam Houston. So I don't think it gets much better than that. Having Salter, like I'm loving.
Yeah, that is absolutely. I haven't looked at the depth of all the details for everybody else in the turning upward, but I can totally understand why he is at number 1 there in a sense, even though this isn't a ranked group. Because you don't get much better than that schedule. If Liberty puts any semblance of an offense out there around him, so that also benefits any other Liberty offensive players as well.
Cooley at running back, yep.
That's an incredible.
End up being absolutely
incredible. UMass and Sam Houston are probably going to be near the bottom overall in FBS schools when it comes to their overall what they're going to put on the field. Like you said, Western Kentucky being a team that's always about shootouts. So yeah, you don't get much better than that in those 3 weeks.
Yeah, Western Kentucky's defense isn't bad, but you just expect the over-under to be like 80 for that game. Byron Brown and USF. USF obviously has some great wide receiver options too because of Brown. At Charlotte, Tulsa at home in the college fantasy semifinal, and then at Rice. His bye weeks are weeks 6 and 9, really similar to Salter, where it's like you got a clear little patch there where you'll need a good backup, assuming these guys are healthy come the end of the year. but incredibly favorable schedule for USF.
Yeah, that's another one. You don't get much better than that. Tulsa's had a better team here recently. But yeah, 2 teams with Charlotte and Rice. Yeah, that's whew.
So how does this affect you if we look at one of the negative ones, just because he's sandwiched there in between Brown and Salter in the rankings currently, Dylan Gabriel, Oregon. That offense is going to be one of the best offenses in the country. And a lot of like Gabriel is expected to be really, really good. Heisman finalist type of year, amazing wide receiver talent, great O-line, but it's at Wisconsin, week 1 of the playoffs, then a bye week, then finishes off at home against Washington, which should be fine. But the first game is a little bit scary at Wisconsin. If that was a home game, I'd probably feel differently, but Wisconsin, solid defense, and that's a tough place to play. And then a bye week where you have to sit them. So you're hoping to make it to that championship game, but how does that affect how you would draft those quarterbacks, or does it? Would you just roll with Gabriel because of the points?
So kind of like we talked about earlier, if this is a dynasty league or a Devy league, it's not going to affect my thought process in any way other than to make sure that I've got somebody else that I feel like is going to be able to take over in that week. If I'm in a dynasty redraft, if I'm in a seasonal redraft league, it definitely might make me think twice. Is there somebody else on the board that is going to be able to be around there? The one thing I will always weigh is you got to get there. You got to get to the playoffs first. So I'm not going to jeopardize my ability to get to the playoffs thinking too far ahead, because if you're not in the playoffs, it doesn't matter if you can start a guy in week 13 or not. But I definitely am not going to pick some other quarterback that's got to buy in week 13. That's for sure. That's how it would affect. It wouldn't affect my decision to pick him. It would affect who else I'm going to get and make absolutely sure that my number 2 guy is going to be available at that point.
Super important when it comes to draft strategy, just knowing the weakness. Yeah. And I'm not going to drop out of that tier. Like, I view those top 3 as like the top tier guys in the draft. Or quarterbacks in the draft, sorry, for CFF this year. So I'm not going to go with someone else, I don't think, over Gabriel, like you said, because I got to get to the playoffs. But knowing that the weakness is there, I really have to make sure I've got someone solid and healthy weeks 12 and 13.
And I think that bye weeks are more important to pay attention to than bad matchups here, because a player can go in and exceed expectations in a bad matchup. You don't know what they're capable of in a bad matchup, but a bye week, you're guaranteed that guy is going to be a 0. You can't overcome a bye week without also drafting for that guy. So that's the thing to really pay attention to there as well.
Another favorable one that I have here to talk about is Kansas. Kansas. So you're thinking, all right, I've got Jalen Daniels at quarterback, Devin Neal. Those are going to be some premier players for your fantasy team. I love what they have in terms of bye weeks. So let's take a look. At BYU, week 11. Colorado. 12. You're right. Colorado, week 13. And then at Baylor in the championship game. So I like them. I think especially that game against Colorado, you just assume it's going to be a shootout there again in the semifinal.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you'll notice too, some people, if you're an experienced player in college fantasy football, this is not going to be something that's going to get stuck in your head. But if you're somebody that's brand new coming in, you can't get hung up on Power 5 schools. Oh, I got to have all these Alabama players. I got to have this. Alabama's playing normally the weakness of their schedule at the beginning of the season and the week before rivalry week. So it could be the semis, but normally they're playing an SEC schedule or a rival then. So even if it's, a little bit, their value might drop just slightly at the end of the season, whereas your group of 5 schools are going to have their value rise at the end of the season because they're not playing an Alabama in a money game in week 2 or traveling to Wisconsin in week 3 or something like that. They're going to be playing teams at their caliber where they can be going out there and just lighting up the scoreboard.
100%. I switched the screen over to running backs, and let's look at one that's really good, I think, for Nick Singleton here. So Penn State, we're going at Purdue, at Minnesota. So that stinks. 2 road games. And then Maryland. So if this works out for Penn State, Drew Aller takes a leap, which a lot of NFL scouts expect him to this year. And if Singleton gets what we expect him to get in terms of workload, that should be a solid, startable, depending again on workload. What percentage of the carries and touchdowns is he getting up to that point to give you the confidence to start him in the playoffs? But if you have Drew Aller, if you got Nick Singleton, you got to like that fantasy playoffs there. No great defense that he's going up against, just 3 solid opponents. They'll play the whole game kind of thing.
Yeah, you're also talking about a running back, so somebody on the ground, whether it's, cold weather, whatever, is not going to matter as much to him. Even wind, things like that aren't going to matter as much to a running back as they are to a quarterback or a wide receiver. So I agree with you on that completely about Singleton.
I'm going to switch back over to quarterback. Let's look at Jalen Raynor and the Arkansas State schedule. So they have bye weeks 5 and 10. Fantasy playoffs are at Georgia State, Louisiana Monroe, Old Dominion. We've got him right now at QB 14. So Matt, I'll put you on the spot here. So 2 ahead of him, we have Jalen Milroe. They play Mercer, which, will he play half of that game because it's going to be a beatdown? And then at Oklahoma and then Auburn. Does that affect how you would draft Raynor or Jalen Milroe there at Raynor at 14?
Well, I will say this. Again, I think in any league, I'm probably going to be drafting Milroe above anybody. And I don't mean above any other quarterback that's out there, but there, like you said, there's certain tiers. But if I'm thinking specifically about the playoffs, outside of that Mercer game. But yeah, I agree with you. Mercer, he might not play a whole lot in that game. He might get in for the first quarter, maybe the first half.
Right.
I would say the way I would take it is I would say from somebody like you who's ranking, you have him at QB 14, but I would be, if everything was to stay static as it is now, we know there's going to be people during the season that are going to come out of nowhere. But if everything stayed static as it is right now, your QB 14 is probably going to be in the top 6 in those last couple of weeks, just based on the schedule. And so I think that's somebody you would want to think about having on your roster. I don't think I wouldn't draft him over Milroe, but I could completely see how if I had a waiver wire pickup and if for some unknown reason, both of those guys were sitting on the waiver wire at the end of the season, I probably would take Raynor over Milroe specifically for that reason.
At Arizona, so those fantasy playoffs, we've got Houston at home, at TCU, should be a shootout, and then Arizona State at home. Super favorable schedule. Now the kicker with Arizona is how do they do in the coaching change with all the turnover that's happened there. But you got to like it with Fafita and those guys over at Arizona. Tet McMillan, you got to feel great about him, our number 1 projected fantasy wide receiver for 2024. Super favorable schedule. Their bye weeks are week 4, 11. Great stretch through the playoffs.
Yeah, normally you're going to be paying attention to that week 11, but again, with this season being one of the unicorn years, it happens every 6 to 7 years, where you have week 11 is the last week of the regular season, not the playoffs. 11 does not have as much importance in that bye week.
So a couple more here of good ones. And so this is a good example for someone that's lower tier. He's going to be available later in the draft for you at quarterback. If you draft someone like Dylan Gabriel, who in the first 2 weeks of the fantasy playoffs, he's I wouldn't say unstartable, depending on your lineup where he's at Wisconsin, but then a bye week 13. So Chandler Morris is a really good one. You can use this search tool here. So North Texas, we've got him at QB 36, but very favorable at UTSA. If you're not super familiar with them, that is going to be a more difficult game. But then ECU, week 13, and then at Temple, week 14. So I like a guy like Chandler Morris to, draft later on if you've got someone like Dylan Gabriel who's got a tough bye weeks in there. And then lastly, Notre Dame got Virginia and home against Army, and then at USC. And USC is known for their defense, but they're just known for how bad they are at defense. So I think that's a good one there for Riley Leonarding.
I was wondering where you were going with that. I was like, what? Yeah, the one thing about Notre Dame's schedule that I would say you want to take a little bit of pause at is that Army game when you're playing any of the service academies.
Valid.
Any of the service academies, they'll have some of those weird games where like they want to run the ball 50 times, and
Right.
they might be eating the clock up. So that's the one thing I pay attention to is look at the way that Army's team plays throughout the season. Look at their time of possession before you make a decision to start a Notre Dame player in that week 13, because there are times when the service academies will just eat the clock up and your guys might not get as many opportunities to put their hands on the ball. So just pay attention to that when you get to week 13 with your Notre Dame players.
All right. So I got a caution against Georgia Tech a little bit. I think one of the most fun stacks in college fantasy this year, which should be a show that we do, I guess, at some point, but Haynes King to Eric Singleton. Singleton was great as a freshman, probably better this year, but you're not going to start him in the fantasy playoffs. You got a bye week, week 12. NC State at home. Yeah, maybe you start him there. NC State starting out 18th, I think, ish, but pretty talented. Maybe you can start him there in this fantasy semifinal. And then at Georgia in the championship game. Man, that sucks for a closing of the season. That's potentially one of the worst ones out there.
Yeah, that's definitely that is definitely the unstartable matchup right there in that championship game. That's the kind of thing that you absolutely would be paying attention to because, Haynes King could be a top quarterback for your team, but you are not going to think about starting him at Georgia in the college football championship at all. So that becomes an unstartable for me.
So as you're drafting Curtis Rourke and you want to play him in the fantasy playoffs, that's not going to happen. He's most likely going to be your QB2 if you draft him somewhere in that ADP in a 12-team league. So fantasy playoffs, though, you get a bye week, and then you're at Ohio State, and then Purdue. So, hey, you can start him against Purdue, but those first couple fantasy playoff weeks are brutal.
Yeah, you got to get to that Purdue game first. If you don't have something for that week 12 and week 13, you're not getting to 14 with him.
Yeah, so let's take a look here at, Jackson Arnold and all the Oklahoma boys. I'll pull him up here. So we've got a bye week. All right, I filtered it here. So we got a bye week, week 12, playing against Alabama, week 13, and then at LSU.
Yeah, that's a rough one. I mean, now with it being Oklahoma and the kind of offense they have, I might give them a little more consideration because sometimes you get to the end of the season and those SEC matchups, you might be able to get a shootout going on.
Right.
But just on paper, looking at a team with that kind of lineup, yeah, that's definitely not somebody that I don't want that to be my only option. I want to have other options to choose from other than a bye week. Again, you can see there's a lot of theme here. You got a bye week, you can't even play them at all. It's not even a consideration. But coming off that bye week, Alabama and then at LSU, that's brutal.
Yeah, LSU was terrible at defense last year, so you expect them to be a little bit better, and then that's going to be a likely night game in Baton Rouge. That's going to be a tough one for Sawchuk, for Arnold, and all of them. That's one, obviously, you'll see how LSU's defense might improve over the year or not. But either way, it is a brutal playoff schedule for Oklahoma and anyone you've got there. And, of course, Florida, it's well known. They've got a great or the toughest schedule in the country. But LSU, Ole Miss, at Florida State, you're not going to have a ton of Gators on your team probably, but Eugene Wilson is a borderline wide receiver one on some rankings, and I think we've got him there. You'll have a guy that gets targeted a ton throughout the season that you'll rely on throughout the season. But then in the fantasy playoffs, like, that's going to be brutal.
And that's interesting too, because we talk about, you even mentioned it earlier, that historically the SEC has got beat down money games during the fantasy football playoffs. And Florida definitely does not have a beat down there. How did Florida's schedule get screwed up to where there's no beat down game at that point, BMAC?
I don't know. They produced the new schedule, and it's been pretty famously talked about by Late Kick and Josh Pate, and just how brutal it is. Like, the schedule is insane if you haven't seen it, which you probably have.
Well, and the thing is too, is if Florida was at the top of the ebbs and flows, you might say, oh, Florida's got this, but Florida's not exactly at the top of it right now. They're kind of in that valley. So having a team that is in a rebuilding mode with a schedule like that, I'm sure you as a Florida fan are not thrilled with the prospects of ending a season like that.
No, because it's all the hot seat talk and all that stuff, and it starts off with Miami, and then we get the one beatdown game on the schedule: Samford, Texas A&M, at Mississippi State, UCF, at Tennessee, at Kentucky, and then it ends like this: Georgia, at Texas, LSU, Ole Miss, at Florida State. That's going to be a tough schedule. Insane. Some people are saying it's like the toughest schedule.
That's
history.
Crazy. That's I would not be surprised. That is a pretty insane schedule. Pretty insane schedule right there. But let's go on to another school that you think has got an unfavorable matchup for the college fantasy playoffs in Minnesota.
So Mike Davis, who I've been trying to trade for Darius Taylor from him like all offseason sporadically. I'm kind of glad it didn't happen after doing this research and adding these in here. So Darius Taylor is unstartable in the fantasy playoffs. He's someone that you'll rely on, and you're going to draft him as your RB1, likely, if you draft him in a redraft league because of his ADP. So bye week 12, then Penn State, week 13, and then at Wisconsin. Not startable whatsoever. Maybe you start him at Wisconsin, but still, that's again a tough place to play, and historically really good run defense. We'll see how things trend over the course of the season with the 2024 version of Wisconsin, but dang, that's a really tough set of defenses, and of course the bye week there for Darius Taylor.
Yeah, that's a rough schedule. And then we go to a good old UCF making their move up to a Power 5 conference. What do you think about their schedule down the road here?
Another top running back, and of course KJ Jefferson at quarterback. It's just tough. Like, it's a bye week, and then it's at West Virginia, which should be fine to start them there, and then Utah, which have the best defense in the Big 12 in the fantasy championship. So tough schedule there for RJ Harvey, KJ Jefferson, and all those guys. Borderline unstartable there. I'll start them against West Virginia probably, but
I think the one saving grace on that schedule, though, is they're playing Utah at home. They're not having to travel to Utah. I think that's going to probably be one of those where if you have some of those like intangible points, you might bump UCF up just a little bit, because historically these West Coast to East Coast, or Hawaii to the mainland games, are really difficult on college teams during the season. So that might be a little bit of an advantage for UCF.
It's a really good
just,
point.
Yeah, keep that in mind just a little bit there. If
We're
this was the other way around, that'd be brutal.
Yeah, we're gonna have more of that to follow. Like thinking of, whatever, USC traveling to Rutgers and seeing if there's some sort of a hangover that affects fantasy. So those kind of games will be new.
Well, you also have in the ACC, teams, from the Carolinas having to travel to Stanford or travel to Cal, or vice versa. That's going to be a brutal schedule. All these cross-country trips. I mean, you talk about it in the NFL all the time about how teams that have all these flight miles, how difficult it is on their bodies. And now you've got the Cals and the Stanfords that are having to play teams on the East Coast and vice versa. It's going to be very interesting to see how that all plays out in the ACC.
All right, we'll end with Michigan. You get a bye week in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. So I'm looking at, Donovan Edwards here as a top RB1, or low end RB1 if that's the cost, depending on your league there. Potentially a high end RB2. It's going to be tough. So it's bye week, and then it's Northwestern at home. Easy start there. And then at Ohio State, which Michigan has run all over Ohio State recently, but I don't think that's just going to continue. To be seen, obviously, but there's still risk there. Like you see at Ohio State, and you don't feel great about that start.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. I mean, again, like we talked about, you get to the end of the season, rivalry games, maybe it becomes a shootout because it's a rivalry game, but you don't want to be banking on that. That's not a smart decision to bank on as your only determining factor when it comes to your fantasy starting lineups at that point. Now, hopefully, if your team is good enough, you can get that bye in the first week of the fantasy playoffs, and you might be able to escape all these week 12 buys. But again,
absolutely.
But again, you can't be banking on that. You can't be banking that you're not going to have that game, because if it's a league like ours, only 2 teams are going to get that bye. So unless your team is that good, you have to prepare. What are you going to do to be able to get through that wild card round? All right, so there we go. That is our look at the top teams we think are trending good or trending bad for their schedules in the college fantasy playoffs. If you are listening to this, we definitely would want you to go into the comments on YouTube, go to the Discord channel. We want to know what you think about the teams that we've put into who we think are trending down: Liberty, USF, Kansas, Penn State, Arkansas State, Arizona, Notre Dame, North Texas as the teams that we say could have favorable matchups and their players favorable matchups in the college fantasy playoffs, and the teams we think have unfavorable matchups: Oregon, Georgia Tech, Indiana, Oklahoma, Florida, Minnesota, UCF, Michigan. Do you guys agree with these? Do you disagree? Do you think there are other teams that are out there that might have favorable matchups that we've left off the list, or unfavorable matchups that we have left off the list? We want to hear from you guys, and you guys tell us your thoughts, who you would add, who you would take away, and go from there. BMAC, any more updates on the website? Anything on the rankings that you want to let everybody know about?
Going through roster validation for every single team. I posted this in the Discord. I got through the SEC and Big Ten, or at least most of the Big Ten. So I've still got the rest of them to go. I'm just chunking that out, making sure everything is buttoned up and good to go. And that's really the bulk of it, is going through, making sure everything's buttoned up, and adding in conferences, bye weeks, and fantasy playoffs, and open to any other ideas. But very soon, we're going to have some fall reports coming out and all that stuff. So can't wait for that.
We're talking about, we are probably a little over 2 months until we start having our draft. I know that the sites say they want you to draft as deep into the off season as you can. We're going to be drafting 9 weeks from now or so. That's about when we're going to be drafting.
Yeah. And Uncle Joe said he listened to the pod when we talked about him being the only one that do the draft. And he was like, I'm fine with Wednesday. He texted me yesterday. He's like, I've been catching up on the podcast and I'm fine with Wednesday now.
He better be fine with Wednesday.
Right.
I can tell you for both BMAC and I, over time, August has become one of those months where it's heavy on preseason stuff. But when you're in a bunch of different leagues, BMAC's got a lot of stuff personally with his kids. I've got a lot of stuff within Symmetry Creations where I'm traveling a lot, and doing drafts on the weekends has become really difficult. And we've got other guys in our league that people have done nonsensical things like get married on a weekend where a fantasy football draft could be held. And every year it's like, hey guys, it's my anniversary. I can't be at the draft. And, all kinds of nonsense like that. So sometimes you have to draft on a Wednesday for a college fantasy league, man.
Yeah, it'll be different. It'll be worse. That's for sure. But we'll have the most fun we can with it.
All right. Well, we thank you guys so much for coming out and listening to the podcast this week. Really enjoy being able to talk college fantasy football in ways that you might not normally think about. Hopefully it spurs you to think in a little more creative ways when you're putting your roster together. That way you can get the leg up. And another way to get the leg up is to become a subscriber to CFBDynasty.com. You want to go up to the website, become a subscriber. That way you can be the first one to get your hands on in-season information. That's when it's going to be most beneficial during the draft, in-season information, so that you can get a leg up on your competition, so that you cannot be like the Florida teams in 2023 and be the bridesmaid, so that you can be the bride and take on the championship in 2024.
Let's go.
All right. On behalf of founder and creator Brian McElfresh, my name is Matt Knowles. We thank you guys for coming out and listening to the CFB Dynasty podcast this week. See ya.
Thank you for listening to the CFB Dynasty Podcast. Help us out by subscribing on YouTube and reviewing us on your podcast network.